It began on a late autumn morning, high in the hills of eastern Tennessee. The temperature had dipped below freezing overnight, 28 degrees by the thermometer on the kitchen window. Frost traced delicate veins across the porch boards, and a slow wind whispered through the tall white pines, carrying the metallic scent of cold water from the creek below. In this quiet place where the nearest neighbor was half a mile down a winding gravel road, every sound was amplified: the drip of melting frost, the distant caw of a crow, the soft creak of an old porch swing swaying without a push. Nature here was not empty. It was attentive, waiting. Far below the porch, a world of survival played out unseen. Autumn in the Smokies is a season of preparation. Squirrels stashed the last of their acorns, deer moved cautiously in the thinning cover, and predators traveled with patience in their paws. For a tiny bobcat kitten, barely 6 weeks old, ears still too large for its head, survival meant silence. Biologists know that young bobcats will often freeze and remain absolutely still when threatened, their only defense against larger predators. That instinct, honed over thousands of years, would be the very thing that carried it to the edge of a human life it did not yet understand. Inside the cabin, Eleanor Hart, Ellie to anyone who ever knew her before grief carved her world smaller, stood cradling a chipped blue mug in both hands. Her fingers were stiff from the cold, despite the wood stove's early fire. A retired literature teacher, she had come here to these mountains 2 years ago after her husband's sudden passing, trading the chatter of classrooms for the hush of ridges and hollows. Her world had narrowed to the creak of the house, the whisper of wind through pine needles, and the soft thud of Marble, her 12-year-old ginger tabby, hopping onto the windowsill each morning to keep Waka. Marble had grown quieter since the loss of the family dog last winter. Once a cat of small rebellions and loud opinions, he now spent hours staring out windows as if waiting for someone he couldn't name. Sometimes Ellie caught his reflection in the glass and felt an ache of recognition. Two solitary souls in an old cabin, holding their silence like a fragile truce. That morning, Ellie opened the back door and stepped onto the frosted porch, pulling her worn cardigan tighter. The boards were slick under her wool socks, and the cold bit through in an instant. She scanned the tree line the way she always did, more out of habit than expectation. A curl of mist rose from the creek, catching the first rays of sun as if the mountain exhaled. Marble pressed against her leg, tail curling in question. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments and let's see how far stories like this can travel. Ellie took a slow breath, the kind that fogged in front of her face, and sipped her tea. She felt the weight of the quiet press in, the kind that could be both comfort and cage. Her heart still flinched at sudden memories, her husband's laugh echoing in the old kitchen, the hollow slam of the screen door when no one followed. Out here, there were no neighbors to break the spell, no casual human noise, just her, Marble, and the unrelenting honesty of nature. A rustle in the brush below the porch broke the rhythm. Marble's ears twitched, and his tail flicked once, then stilled. Ellie froze, mug halfway to her lips. She expected a squirrel, maybe a rabbit, but there was something different in the cadence of the movement, soft, deliberate, as if whatever lurked there had learned that survival depended on being unseen. She leaned on the porch rail, heart ticking faster, scanning the shadows between the bare underbrush. Nothing, only a breath of wind and the faint sound of water under ice. But Marble didn't move. His eyes, amber in the low light, stayed fixed on a single patch of shadow. Ellie shivered, though not entirely from the cold. She felt the tingle of being observed, though she saw no eyes in the dark. There, just beyond the reach of comfort, something had paused on the edge of her world. She didn't know it yet, but this was the moment everything in her quiet life began to shift. The first ripple of a story that would carry through frost and snow and into the bloom of spring. She exhaled, brushed a thumb over the warm rim of her mug, and murmured to Marble, "Feels like something's out there, doesn't it, boy?" Marble only blinked, patient and still. Now back to the mountain morning where something extraordinary waited just beyond the porch. The mountains held their breath that morning, as if the world itself understood that something fragile hovered on the edge of discovery. Mist threaded between the trees like silver thread, weaving in and out of bare branches. Frost clung to the pine needles, each crystal catching the first hesitant sunbeam. The creek below whispered under a thin skin of ice, its sound both distant and intimate, as if the mountain had a pulse that only revealed itself when you were willing to listen. Ellie's cabin sat on a small rise, its weathered planks and stone chimney blending naturally with the landscape. Out here in the Smoky Mountains, the forest didn't just surround a home, it absorbed it. Her porch faced a slope that fell away toward the creek, a mosaic of dry leaves and exposed roots winding like veins down to the water. Squirrels flicked their tails in short, nervous bursts, disappearing into hollows at the faintest whisper of wind. Jays quarrel. In the distance, their voices sharp enough to carry through the thinning autumn air. Marble crouched at the edge of the porch, tail wrapped neatly around his paws, eyes tracking the world with the patience of a cat who understood that movement was an invitation. He was a silent sentinel, nose twitching at scents only he could unravel. To him, this mountain morning was full of coded messages. A fox had passed by in the night, raccoons had left wet prints near the creek, and somewhere in the underbrush, a smaller, unfamiliar heartbeat waited. Down in the brush, the bobcat kitten lingered in the shadow of a fallen log. Its fur was a soft mixture of muted tan and dusky spots, blending perfectly with the forest floor. Tiny ear tufts, the hallmark of its species, flicked at every sound, each movement precise and instinctive. At this age, biologists would note, a bobcat's survival depends entirely on stillness and caution. A wrong move, a misjudged approach to a predator or a human, could end its story before it ever truly began. The kitten's belly pressed low against the cold earth, and a shiver ran along its spine. Hunger gnawed, but instinct whispered, "Wait, watch, don't show weakness." This was the lesson carved into its bloodline. The woods smelled of wet leaves, pine sap, and the faint trace of smoke from Ellie's chimney, an aroma both alien and oddly comforting. Above, the wind shifted, carrying the sound of a creaking porch board. Marble's silhouette loomed against the brightening sky, and for a heartbeat, the kitten froze completely, muscles coiled tight, its pale golden eyes fixed on the domestic cat. Two worlds regarded each other, one belonging to the structured safety of humans, the other to the raw, unpromised ledger of the wild. Ellie, unaware of the precise drama unfolding just beyond her sight, took a step off the porch and felt the crunch of frost beneath her boots. She inhaled the kind of cold air that made her chest ache in a good way, a reminder she was still here, still moving. The silence wasn't empty, it was attentive. The forest always had a way of listening, of noticing without judgment. Somewhere above, a red-tailed hawk cried out, and the bobcat kitten flinched, instinctively pressing flatter against the soil. Predators could come from anywhere in this world, air, water, or earth. Its small heart thudded so fast it almost hummed in its chest, but it didn't move. That stillness, that dignified endurance, was its only shield. Ellie poured the last of her tea over the edge of the porch, steam rising briefly before the cold claimed it. She thought about how the seasons would soon turn harsher. Up here, winter arrived not with a single storm, but as a slow tightening of the world, a longer frost, a biting wind, a silence that pressed heavier on the heart. She glanced at Marble, whose attention was fixed on the slope, and followed his gaze without seeing the hidden watcher. For now, the morning remained a fragile truce between worlds. The human and her old cat went about their quiet ritual. The bobcat, alone and half-hidden, endured in the brittle beauty of late autumn. Nature often stages its most profound moments in these ordinary pauses, where no one knows a story is beginning except the ones willing to wait and watch. A leaf skittered across the porch with a sound like whispered paper, and Ellie felt the subtle unease of being noticed by something she could not see. She rubbed her hands together and let the cold settle in her lungs. Somewhere below, a small life clung to the edges of hers, and though neither knew it yet, their paths were already braided by the mountain's patient hand. The sun rose higher, casting thin beams through the branches, lighting the frost into a fleeting constellation. The day would warm slightly, but the night would return colder, pressing the silent drama toward its next inevitable step. For now, the forest exhaled, and the mountain waited. And with that waiting, a story deepened. One of quiet observation, of survival without fanfare, and of love that had not yet found its name. Under the slope of the porch, where sunlight only reached in fractured shards, the bobcat kitten curled into itself. Its body was a bundle of quiet survival, fur puffed against the bite of the cold. Every heartbeat was a measured act of endurance. At 6 weeks old, it carried the look of a creature sculpted by instinct alone. Ear tufts twitching, golden eyes half-lidded, paws tucked tight beneath a narrow chest. To the world beyond that shadowed hollow, the kitten was invisible. This invisibility was not fear, it was dignity. In the wild, small lives, survive not by demanding attention, but by becoming part of the silence. Biologists know that young bobcats, left without a mother, will often remain perfectly still for hours, muscles tight and patient, waiting for a safety that may never arrive. This kitten knew that stillness as its only language. Its stomach cramped with the slow ache of hunger. In the last 2 days, it had licked dew from curled leaves and tasted the bitter tang of a chewed twig, instincts confused but determined. The scent of food, dry and faint, had drifted from the porch that morning, mingling with smoke and pine. That scent was strange, but it was a thread, pulling at the part of its small body that still believed in life. The world here was a tapestry of textures and whispers. A breeze slid under the porch, carrying the cool scent of the creek and the musky undertones of raccoon tracks. Frosted leaves crackled softly as they thawed, and the boards above gave occasional sighs when Marble shifted his weight. To the kitten, these sounds formed a map of safety and threat, a living diagram of the world's edges. Its eyes, wide and luminous, followed every flicker of light along the forest floor. When a chickadee hopped too close, the kitten's tail twitched once, barely an instinctive spark of play or hunger, before settling still again. Even at this age, the bobcat's future prowler lived in miniature, a predator with paws too big for its body, ears constantly catching every ripple in the air. Above, Marble leaned over the edge of the porch, his tail flicking slowly. The domestic cat's body language was measured and unthreatening, ears forward, whiskers relaxed. He had noticed the wild presence, yet his response was not aggression. There was a kind of feline recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of another creature shaped by solitude. To Marble, this was not an intruder. It was a mirror of himself in smaller, hungrier form. Ellie had gone back inside, leaving the porch empty except for her vigilant cat. Through the cabin window, the faint scent of wood smoke drifted out, and the bobcat's nose quivered. For a moment its mind, simple but profound, balanced the equation of risk and need. Hunger pulled one way, instinct pulled another. The body chose stillness, the only choice it fully understood. In that stillness, the forest around it became an extension of its own pulse. The scratch of a squirrel on bark, the pop of ice breaking in the creek, the distant rhythmic call of a woodpecker. Each sound was catalogued in the wordless memory that guided survival. Even its shivers were calculated, muscles tight, eaning to trap what little warmth remained. In its small instinctive consciousness, thoughts were not sentences, but sensations. Cold, watch, wait. Safe? not safe, alone. And yet, beneath that primal survival, something quieter pulsed, a flicker of curiosity, a whisper of hope that maybe the scent of warmth and food from above meant life could stretch another day. The sun shifted, and a single beam of light pierced the space beneath the porch, warming the kitten's fur for the briefest moment. It did not move to chase the warmth. Movement invited danger, but its eyes closed halfway, soaking in that fragile gift. In that fleeting pause, the shadowed hollow became a tiny cathedral of endurance. Every life, human or animal, carries a story of survival that begins long before anyone notices. The bobcat's story was writing itself in paw prints on frost, and in the slow rhythm of breaths held and released in darkness. It was a life that asked for nothing, demanded nothing, and yet in its quiet dignity, deserved everything. Up above, marble stretched and yawned. The porch creaked, and a single dry leaf tumbled into the hollow. The bobcat sniffed it, nose trembling, then rested its head back on its paws. Somewhere deep in its wild little heart, a truth settled. Not all dangers came with teeth, and not all safety roared. The forest held its silence. The mountain exhaled. And in the invisible space between predator and prey, between loneliness and hope, a thread of connection was forming, so delicate it could have snapped with a single loud moment. Soon, that thread would tighten into a story that none of them, human, domestic cat, or wild kitten, could have imagined. The fourth morning arrived colder than the ones before, as if the mountain had decided to test every creature that called it home. A thin sheet of ice had formed along the porch steps, catching the pale blue light of dawn. The air carried that metallic edge that made each breath sting slightly in the lungs, and the sky was the washed-out gray of early winter preparing its grip. Beneath the porch, the bobcat kitten's world had shrunk to a small circle of frost-bitten leaves and shadow. Its body, though small and trembling, held itself with the same quiet resolve that had carried it through the past few days. The wild had no mercy for weakness, but it also offered a strange kind of honor. The dignity of survival was in the attempt itself, in enduring without complaint. Its ribs were visible now, faint outlines beneath the spotted fur. Hunger had a rhythm, a cycle the kitten had learned in its short life. First, the sharp pangs that made the stomach twist, then a dull heaviness, a quiet fatigue that made movement feel expensive. It licked the frost from the edge of a fallen leaf, the taste sharp and metallic, enough to wet a dry tongue, but not enough to quiet the deeper ache. Out in the forest, life moved on, oblivious to the small crisis unfolding in silence. A pair of cardinals flitted through the branches above, their red feathers stark against the bare trees. Somewhere in the distance a woodpecker hammered a steady beat into an old trunk, searching for breakfast. None of these lives paused for the kitten's struggle. Nature noticed everything, but it intervened for nothing. Above, Marble prowled along the edge of the porch, his tail flicking in short, deliberate motions. He had begun to notice the subtle changes, the pauses that were a little too long, the scent that drifted up from beneath the boards. Domestic instinct and wild heritage both told him the same story. There was life here, and it was clinging by threads. Ellie noticed changes too, though she didn't yet understand them. She had found tiny paw prints in the frost that morning, no bigger than the tip of her thumb. They followed the edge of the steps, circled the porch, then disappeared back toward the brush. She crouched to study them, her fingers hovering above the impressions. Here was a fragility in those tracks, a lightness that spoke of something both young and cautious. She felt a pang in her chest, one that had little to do with the cold air. In the months since her husband passed, she had learned to live in a world that did not announce itself. Grief, she realized, was not loud for long. It settled like frost, quiet and persistent. Perhaps that was why she noticed things like this now. The way the leaves were pressed just slightly under the steps, the faint sound of movement in the early hours, the feeling that something alive had tethered its fragile hope to her corner of the world. The kitten's suffering was not the dramatic kind that demanded attention. There were no cries, no obvious signals. Its struggle lived in the way it hesitated before moving, in the slow blink of tired eyes, in the way it pressed against the earth as if merging with it could keep it safe. From a biological perspective, its behavior was textbook for an abandoned bobcat. Solitary by nature, these wild cats often go silent when their mother does not return, instinctively avoiding any sound that might attract predators. The very strategy that once kept it safe now threatened its survival. No one would know it needed help unless they learned to read the language of stillness. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something else, faint, dry, and unfamiliar. The kitten's ears twitched, its nose quivering. Above, Marble had left a few crumbs of kibble scattered near the porch edge, remnants of his breakfast. The smell tugged at the bobcat's hunger with a force almost stronger than fear, but instinct still held the leash. Moving toward the scent was a gamble it had not yet decided to take. Ellie straightened from the frost-stiff ground, her breath hanging like a small cloud in front of her face. She couldn't shake the feeling that her home was no longer just hers, that something out there, something small and determined, had cast a thread of presence over her porch. And with that awareness came an unspoken question: how close should she get? As the sun rose and the frost began to melt, the kitten remained still, hidden in its cathedral of shadows. Its quiet suffering went unseen, its hope measured in breaths and the warmth of brief sunbeams. In the wild, life often waits for a miracle in silence. The forest around the cabin exhaled, carrying with it the faintest tremor of urgency. Something would have to give soon: cold, hunger, or fear. And the mountain, patient as ever, waited to see which one would break first. Ellie's heart woke with the cold already settled in her bones. Even with the wood stove crackling softly, the smoky mountain air seeped into the cabin's seams, reminding her that winter would not wait for permission to arrive. She sat up in her creaky bed, rubbing her fingers together to chase warmth back into them. The old quilt that had once been shared now felt too large for one person, heavy with memory rather than comfort. She had built her life here after loss hollowed it out. 2 years ago, she had stood in a hospital room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and pine cleaner, holding her husband's hand as it grew cooler by the hour. After the funeral, the house in town had become unbearable in its echoes. Every creak of the floorboards had felt like a question she could not answer. So she sold nearly everything, bought a weathered cabin in the Smokies, and brought only essentials: her books, a few dishes, and Marble, the aging ginger tabby who had survived the upheaval alongside her. Marble had been her silent companion through every season since. He had grown slower, but his eyes remained sharp. Ellie sometimes believed he understood things she didn't have words for, like the weight of grief that doesn't announce itself, but lingers in the corners of the room. That morning, she shuffled into the small kitchen, the wood floor cold beneath her wool socks. She put the kettle on and leaned against the counter, staring through the window at the frost-furred world. Her breath clouded the glass, and through the foggy patch she saw the familiar line of the porch, the slope toward the creek, and the brush beyond. Unchanged, yet never quite the same. She stepped onto the porch with her chipped blue mug, inhaling the sharp scent of cold pine and faint smoke from her own chimney. Marble followed, tail brushing her calf like punctuation on her routine. He moved to the edge of the porch and froze, ears forward, as if listening to something below. Ellie crouched and noticed the paw prints again, small and precise in the frost. She placed her finger beside one, marveling at how tiny it was, no larger than a coin. Her stomach knotted with something she couldn't quite name. It was recognition, maybe, or empathy, like seeing a fragment of her own life reflected in another's struggle. The mountains had taught her that not every living thing cried for help. Some simply endured until someone noticed. She remembered her first winter here, when the nights had stretched like long corridors, silent and cold. She had gone whole days without speaking, listening instead to the creak of settling wood and the wind through the pines. Grief had made her feral in its own way, surviving on routines instead of nourishment. A faint rustle drifted up from the brush, and she stilled. It wasn't the brisk scuttle of a squirrel or the sharp burst of a bird's landing. This was slower, hesitant, like a whisper made solid. Marble's tail flicked once, his gaze locked downward. Ellie's heart tightened in her chest, and a curious warmth followed, a pulse of protectiveness, though she didn't yet know what she was protecting. She thought of the local wildlife officer she had met last spring at the general store. He had told her that these mountains were alive with more eyes than most people would ever realize. Bobcats, foxes, even the occasional black bear. Most of them want nothing to do with us, he had said, tipping his hat. They survive by keeping their distance. She rose slowly, scanning the underbrush, and caught the briefest shimmer of movement. A tail, perhaps, or a tufted ear. Her chest fluttered. Whatever it was young, vulnerable, and alone. For a long moment she stayed rooted to the porch, the mug warming her hands as her breath clouded in front of her face. A memory surfaced unbidden, herself in the early days after the funeral, sitting on this very porch, hoping the world would notice her without demanding anything from it. The connection was wordless, instinctive. Marble glanced back at her, whiskers twitching, then returned to his vigil. His calm steadiness grounded her, as if he were silently confirming what she already felt. Something down there needed her, whether it asked or not. Ellie took a slow sip of tea and let the steam curl into the cold air. A soft wind shifted the branches, and the faintest scent of damp earth rose from the slope. In that moment she understood the fragility of this silent visitor's life, and the fragility of her own in its quiet way. Inside, the kettle clicked as it cooled, and the cabin exhaled its usual creaks. But Ellie stayed on the porch longer than usual, her senses awake in a way they hadn't been in months. She didn't call out. She didn't move closer. She only noticed, and that noticing felt like the first small step towards something she hadn't expected: connection. Soon, the day would warm, and the frost would vanish, erasing the delicate tracks. But the memory of them had already left its mark, just as the quiet presence beneath. Her porch was beginning to leave its mark on her heart. The next morning, the Smoky Mountains were wrapped in mist so thick it seemed the world had folded in on itself. The porch steps disappeared into a silver haze, and the creek below spoke in muffled whispers, its voice softened by the shroud of fog. Ellie Hart paused at the doorway with her mug of tea, feeling the moisture in the air cling to her skin like a cool hand. Marble brushed against her leg, tail twitching, every line of his body alert but unhurried. It was in this hushed moment that the invisible boundary between human and wild thinned. Beneath the porch, the Bobcat Kitten stirred. Hunger had become a low hum, no longer sharp enough to make it reckless, but insistent enough to draw its gaze upward. The scent of kibble from the night before lingered faintly, a dry, salty aroma that curled through the wooden slats and mixed with the smell of pine and smoke. Instinct warned against movement, but instinct also whispered that survival sometimes meant taking the smallest risk. Ellie stepped onto the porch, the old board sighing under her weight. Her breath puffed in front of her face, briefly visible before the fog swallowed it. She moved with the practiced caution of someone who had learned, through months of solitude, that rushing scared things away, wild animals, fragile memories, even her own fleeting hope. Marble froze, ears pricked. His gaze shifted to a shadow between the porch steps, and Ellie followed it. At first she saw nothing. The fog and the slats of wood conspired to keep the small life hidden. Then a pair of golden eyes caught the faint light, motionless yet electric. Her heart lurched in her chest, not with fear, but with awe. It was so small, its spotted fur damp with dew, its tufted ears like tiny flags of determination. The kitten did not move. Its body was coiled, every muscle taut, but its eyes stayed locked on hers. For a heartbeat, the world shrank to that single thread of recognition. Ellie felt her pulse in her fingertips, her mug trembling slightly in her hand. She knew the rules of these mountains. Wildlife was meant to stay wild. She remembered the wildlife officer's advice. Observe, respect distance, let them choose. And so she did. She didn't step forward or speak. She simply lowered herself to a crouch, her eyes level with the small shadow in the frost. Marble made the first move. The old cat eased down onto his belly, tail curling around his paws, and offered a slow blink, a cat's gesture of peace. The bobcat's ears flicked, processing the message written in body language older than words. A slow blink answered, tentative but real. The fog swirled around them, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Somewhere high above, a crow cawed, breaking the stillness for a single moment before silence reclaimed it. In that silence, Ellie's thoughts swirled with an almost childlike wonder. This was not a scene she could have imagined in her old life of classrooms and car commutes. This was raw and intimate, a conversation without language, a negotiation of trust. The kitten's inner world was a delicate dance between fear and curiosity. Warmth, food, safe, maybe safe. Its paws flexed minutely against the cold earth, but it held its ground. Survival depended on caution, but something in the steady rhythm of the human and the domestic cat above suggested, if not safety, then a lack of threat. Ellie felt an ache rise in her chest, the kind that comes when you see a life balancing on the edge of chance. She wanted to reach out, to scoop it into warmth, to erase the hollow that winter had carved into both of them, but she stayed still. She understood the weight of first meetings, how fragile they were, how one wrong movement could shatter everything. Minutes stretched like threads of spun glass. A leaf, loosened from the eaves, drifted down and landed near the kitten's paw. It flinched, then stilled, the wild instinct never fully yielding. Ellie inhaled and whispered, barely audible, "You're safe here, for now." The kitten didn't move, but it didn't vanish either. That was enough. The fog began to thin as the sun lifted higher, and the first fragile beam of light touched the edge of the porch. Ellie straightened slowly, letting the moment close without forcing it further. Marble remained at his post, guardian and translator, as the wild heart beneath their porch chose, for now, to remain close. Inside, the kettle clicked as it cooled, and the cabin creaked like an old friend shifting in its sleep. On that quiet morning, a silent agreement was written between three lives: the wild, the domestic, and the human, bound together by patience and the faint warmth of shared recognition. Soon, the story would demand more than stillness. Hunger and cold would tip the scales, and decisions would have to be made. But for this first fragile meeting, silence was enough. The morning sun broke through the tree line in fractured beams, gilding the frost on Ellie's porch like tiny shards of glass. It was the first day the air felt sharper than merely cold. It carried the quiet warning of true winter. Ellie opened the cabin door slowly, mug in hand, as Marble slipped past her feet to take his usual post at the porch edge. He moved with unhurried grace, tail upright, ears forward, the ritual of his patrol as familiar as breathing. Beneath the porch, the bobcat kitten waited. Its body had grown leaner, its fur dulled by frost and hunger, yet its golden eyes still burned with alertness. It had spent days measuring this world in heartbeats and scents, existing in the narrow margin between fear and endurance. Instinct said to hide, but hunger had its own voice, quieter than fear, yet relentless. That morning, Marble did something different. He crouched low and gave a long, deliberate, slow blink toward the shadows. In cat language, it was a gesture older than memory. "I see you. I mean no harm." The bobcat froze, its small muscles tightening for the choice between flight and stillness. Then, with careful dignity, it crept forward an inch, paws silent on the frosted leaves. Its body remained low, tail tucked, but it did not run. Ellie held her breath. She had placed a shallow dish of dry kibble near the porch edge the night before, unsure if it would ever be touched. Now, the smell of it curled through the cold air, mingling with pine and wood smoke. The kitten sniffed, ears flicking back and forth like tiny metronomes. It reached the edge of the porch's shadow and hesitated. Marble flicked his tail once and then, without fuss or ceremony, stepped aside. He left the dish unguarded, as if offering silent permission. The kitten took a step, then another. Its paws left perfect little crescents in the frost. When its nose touched the edge of the dish, Ellie's chest tightened. She realized she had been leaning forward, heart pounding, every muscle strung with quiet hope. The first crunch of kibble was almost inaudible, yet it felt like the loudest sound in the world. Marble watched with half-lidded eyes, tail still. Ellie felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the mug in her hand. For the first time in months, she felt seen, not by another person, but by life itself. This small, wild creature had chosen to trust the sliver of safety she and Marble offered. She thought of the nights she had sat on this porch alone, the weight of loss pressing into her ribs like cold stone. How strange, how incredible, that healing could arrive not as words or comfort, but as a silent, spotted kitten chewing dry kibble under the gaze of an old cat. The kitten ate in slow, careful bites, every few seconds pausing to scan the world with those luminous eyes. A blue jay scolded from a nearby branch, and its ears twitched, but it didn't flee. Marble stretched and wise. And the tension in the air softened into something almost tender. Ellie crouched, letting the rim of the porch frame her view. She whispered, "You're braver than I ever was." Her voice was soft enough to be taken by the wind, but speaking it felt like opening a door inside herself. In that instant, the connection crystallized. Human, domestic, and wild. 3 lives intersecting in the quietest of covenants. It wasn't ownership or rescue, not yet. It was recognition, a mutual understanding that survival sometimes needs an audience, that endurance deserves to be witnessed. Ellie's heart swelled with a fragile, grateful ache. She thought of her husband and the silence that had followed his absence, how the cabin had felt like a place where time stood still. And yet, here was proof that life still reached toward warmth, that trust could bloom even after long winters of solitude. The kitten finished a few bites, lifted its head, and for the first time looked directly at Ellie. A single, slow blink, deliberate and unhurried. She felt the weight of it like a benediction. If you've ever witnessed an animal choose to trust you, subscribe to join others who believe connection transcends words. Tell me in the comments, what's the most unforgettable moment you've shared with an animal? The kitten licked its nose and retreated halfway into the shadows again, the spell unbroken. Marble resumed his quiet vigil, tail curled neatly around his paws. Ellie stayed on the porch long after her tea cooled, heart beating to the rhythm of a story she hadn't known she was waiting to live. That night the wind came down from the ridgeline with a sharpness that rattled the shutters on Ellie's cabin. The thermometer by the window read 26 degrees, and the forecast promised the first snow of the season. The Smoky Mountains had a way of turning soft frost into dangerous cold without warning. Ellie sat at the small kitchen table, the lamplight pooling across its surface, her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. Marble dozed on the counter, his tail twitching in restless sleep. Outside, the mountain breathed its winter song, the distant groan of trees shifting in the wind, the hollow rattle of dry leaves skittering across the porch. Beneath those boards, she knew, the Bobcat Kitten was curled into itself, silent as ever. She pictured its thin body pressed to the cold earth, the rise and fall of its small ribs. She imagined the frost creeping in along the edges of its fur. It was one thing to observe a wild creature in its dignity. It was another to watch that dignity inch toward danger with each falling degree. Her mind spun with the wildlife officer's words. Observe. Let nature be nature. She understood the reasoning. Human interference could do more harm than good. A bobcat that learned to rely on people might never thrive on its own. But there was a part of her, quieter, older than logic, that whispered back, "You cannot unsee what you have seen." Marble lifted his head and blinked at her, as if sensing the current of indecision running through the room. Ellie sighed, pressing her palm to the worn wood of the table. "If I do nothing, he might not see morning," she murmured to herself, then caught the echo of her own words. He. She had already given the kitten a shape in her heart, a presence she couldn't separate from her own loneliness. She rose, moving to the cupboard where she kept an old blanket folded and waiting for emergencies. Her fingers hesitated on the fabric. Bringing the kitten closer, even just to offer warmth and food, was crossing a line she couldn't step back from easily. It was the first step toward responsibility, and responsibility meant risk, emotional, ethical, practical. Ellie glanced at the window. Outside, the porch white wall swashed in silver moonlight, the frost gleaming like a thin armor. She thought of the paw prints she had traced that morning, the delicate marks that told a story of survival written in almost nothing. Marble jumped down from the counter, padding silently to the door, tail flicking with a sense of decision that seemed older than both of them. She pulled on her boots and stepped onto the porch. The air bit at her face, sharp enough to make her eyes water. The mountain was silent, except for the whisper of wind through the pines and the far-off gurgle of the creek under its thin ice. Kneeling, she placed the blanket near the edge of the porch where the shadow met the light. She set down a shallow dish of fresh water and another of kibble, the pieces soft from being soaked in warm broth. Then she eased backward, slow and deliberate, giving the wild its space. From the corner of her eye she caught the faintest movement, the glint of golden eyes, half reflecting the porch light. The kitten had been watching, as it always did, silent and calculating. For a long moment it did nothing. The wind rustled the branches, and a single flake of snow drifted past her face. Then, as if pushed by something deeper than hunger, the bobcat crept forward. Ellie's chest tightened. This was no longer just observation. This was an invitation and an acceptance. The kitten sniffed the blanket first, testing the edge of safety, then leaned to lap at the water, tiny tongue flicking with urgency. Inside, warmth glowed from the cabin windows, but Ellie stayed outside, her knees pressing into the cold boards. In the dim light, she felt the weight of the decision settle fully in her bones. She would help. She would risk attachment. She would do what her own heart demanded, even if the world might call it foolish. Above them, the moon sailed quietly over the mountain ridge, and the first real snow out. The season began to fall. The snow came harder than the forecast had warned. By dawn, a pale blanket lay across the porch and the slope beyond, softening the hard edges of the world. Ellie stood at the window, wrapped in her old flannel robe, and felt the quiet weight of worry press against her chest. The thermometer read 23 degrees, and the wind slid along the cabin seams with a low, insistent hum. She scanned the porch, her eyes tracing the spot where the blanket and dish had been left. The blanket was dusted white, edges curled with frost. The water dish had frozen solid overnight, a delicate disk of ice catching the morning light. But it was the paw prints, fresh, precise, moving in circles, that told the story. The kitten had been there, pacing the border between wild instinct and the promise of warmth. Marble leapt to the windowsill, tail swishing, eyes sharp. He had sensed it too. A life clinging to the edge of survival was waiting below, and the mountain would not be forgiving much longer. Ellie pulled on her boots and heavy coat, heart hammering in a rhythm of decision. She stepped onto the porch, the snow crunching beneath her soles. Breath steamed in front of her face, and the air smelled of pine and ice. She crouched low and peered into the shadows under the steps. Two golden eyes stared back. The Bobcat Kitten was curled against the frozen ground, fur clumped with frost, chest rising in small deliberate breaths. Its tail twitched once. Fear, or maybe the last scrap of energy clinging to ritual, but it didn't bolt. Hunger and cold had slowed it, and instinct had measured its odds. Ellie spoke softly, her voice barely above the wind. "It's all right. I'm here." Marble padded to her side, his body language a translation the kitten could understand. He lowered himself to the boards and blinked slowly, his presence a silent bridge. The bobcat's ears flicked forward, then back, eyeing the moment. Ellie reached for the blanket she had left out, now stiff with frost. Moving slowly, she spread it across the porch and placed a fresh dish of warm, softened food at the edge of the light. Steam curled up in the cold air, a fragile thread of invitation. For a long minute, nothing happened. The kitten's gaze flicked between Marble, the dish, and Ellie. Its tiny muscles quivered in hesitation. Snowflakes landed on its whiskers, melting into cold droplets. Then, with the smallest, shuffling step, it crept toward the food. Ellie felt her throat tighten as the bobcat crossed the invisible line between wild and safe. It crouched over the dish and began to eat, jaws moving in slow, deliberate motions. Each bite was a negotiation with fear. Marble watched quietly, a silent sentry. When the kitten finished, Ellie made her choice. She moved the blanket closer, inch by inch, creating a pocket of warmth against the cabin wall. With gloved hands, she tilted the edge into a loose hollow, a den in miniature. She did not touch the kitten. She only offered. The wind gusted, rattling the bare branches, and the kitten startled, body jerking halfway toward the dark. But instead of vanishing, it hesitated, then backed into the blanket's curve, shivering, but still. A soft, instinctive trust had been born of hunger, patience, and silent observation. Ellie stayed crouched on the porch until her legs trembled, letting the moment hold. She thought of all the weeks of grief when she had hidden in her own shadows, waiting for something to notice her. Now she was the one noticing, and it felt like a fragile form of redemption. Inside, the fire snapped in the stove, and warm light spilled from the window across the snow. Marble rose and rubbed his head against Ellie's hand, his purr a faint vibration against the winter air. She exhaled, a long, slow release, as the first stage of their bond solidified, not as ownership, but as shared survival. The mountain, wrapped in its white stillness, seemed to approve in its own quiet way. Snow blanketed the mountain for 3 days, muffling the world in soft white silence. Ellie's cabin became a cocoon against the cold, its windows rimmed with frost and its walls fragrant with pine smoke and simmering broth. Inside, time slowed to the rhythm of quiet care. The Bobcat Kitten had moved indoors, first by accident, then by choice. The transition began when Ellie left the porch door cracked on the coldest night. Marble had curled on the rug by the wood stove, tail flicking an invitation, and the wild little guest had followed the heat like a thread through the doorway. At first it huddled by the threshold, body coiled tight, eyes wide as lanterns, but hunger and exhaustion softened its fear. Within hours, it settled into the corner of the rug, a patch of spotted fur against the warm glow of the fire. Ellie learned to move slowly in her own home, aware that each gesture could ripple through the kitten's fragile trust. She knelt when refilling its shallow dishes with softened food and warm water, never reaching for it, never forcing contact. The air was filled with the soft sounds of chewing, Marble's purr, and the occasional hiss of a log shifting in the stove. The first signs of healing were almost invisible. The kitten's fur began to dry and fluff in the warmth. Its breathing, once shallow and guarded, deepened into slow, even rhythms when it finally slept. A careful observer could see strength returning to its limbs as it explored the edges of the rug, then the hearth, always retreating to the circle of safety Marble had claimed. Biologically, bobcats are solitary, fiercely independent animals. Even as kittens, they resist prolonged handling, relying on self-protection as a default. Ellie respected that nature. She never tried to hold it, only offered warmth, food, and the stillness of a home where survival didn't require constant vigilance. Slowly, the wild creature accepted these gifts, and the lines between instinct and trust blurred. For Ellie, the process was its own kind of medicine. She found herself lingering in the quiet hours, just watching. She noticed the way the kitten's ears swiveled like tiny satellite dishes at every creak of the cabin, how its whiskers quivered when Marble groomed a paw beside it. She felt a stirring in her chest, a cautious bloom of warmth she hadn't allowed in since the funeral. Each small milestone felt monumental. The first time the kitten drank water without flinching at her presence. The first stretch of its back, revealing the healthy tension of a body no longer trapped in pure survival. The first time it leaned, almost imperceptibly, toward Marble's fur, sharing heat like a secret. Outside, the mountain endured winter's grip. Icicles hung from the eaves like crystal teeth, and the creek below froze in places, its song muted under the ice. Birds scavenged along the edges of the cabin where Ellie scattered seeds, and deer appeared at dusk like silent ghosts. In that stillness, the small cabin became a sanctuary, a place where grief, wildness, and fragile hope coexisted without crowding each other. Not every day was easy. There were moments when the kitten startled at the sound of the kettle whistle, or the groan of the roof in the wind, retreating under the table to press flat against the floorboards. Ellie learned to pause, to wait, to let trust reroot itself in its own time. She thought often of the wildlife officer's warning and reminded herself that this was temporary. Her role was not to claim the creature, but to be its bridge between struggle and strength. Weeks passed, and the change was undeniable. The bobcat's coat shone with health, and its movements became fluid, confident. It no longer trembled when Ellie crossed the room. Marble, once an aloof elder, had become an unlikely mentor, sharing sunbeams, meals, and the occasional gentle nudge that guided the kitten toward the window to watch the snow fall. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the ridgeline and the cabin filled with amber light, Ellie realized she was smiling without effort. The room, once a hollow echo of absence, now pulsed with quiet life. Healing had crept in not with grand declarations, but with paw prints, patience, and the soft rhythm of survival becoming trust. And in that soft trust, Ellie felt something in herself begin to thaw. By late winter, the mountains had begun their subtle shift toward spring. Snow still clung to the shadowed hollows, but the edges of the creek sang louder each day as ice surrendered to meltwater. Sunlight lingered a few minutes longer each evening, catching in the icicles that dripped from the cabin eaves like slow metronomes. The world, once locked in silence, was learning to breathe again. Inside, the change was even more profound. The bobcat kitten, no longer frail, no longer trembling, moved through the cabin with measured confidence. Its spotted coat had grown sleek, and the tufts at the tips of its ears now stood proudly, tiny banners of survival. Marble trailed it like a patient shadow, no longer a solitary sentinel, but a guide and companion. Sometimes they shared the rug by the wood stove, their bodies almost touching, the old cat's tail flicking in lazy rhythm, while the young one stretched its limbs in sunlight like a royal heir to a kingdom it hadn't known existed months ago. Ellie watched them from her rocking chair, hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold, and realized that the cabin no longer felt like a place of absence. It felt inhabited, not just by bodies but by life. There was movement where there had been stillness, soft sound where there had been hollow quiet. The rhythm of feeding, cleaning, and simply observing had reshaped her days into something that felt whole. The transformation wasn't just the kitten's, it was hers. Grief had pressed her into shadows, the way winter presses small creatures into burrows. She had believed, quietly and without admitting it aloud, that her heart might never seek warmth again, but caring for this wild life, respecting its boundaries and celebrating each small victory, had thawed something she thought was frozen for good. One morning she opened the cabin door to a world glazed with frost and new sunlight. The kitten padded to the threshold, ears pricked, nose testing the air. It had grown strong enough now to explore beyond the porch with Marble close behind. Ellie's chest swelled with conflicting emotions, pride, fear, and the bittersweet knowledge that this little life was never truly hers to keep. She followed them onto the porch. Frost crunched under her boots, and the sun broke across the treetops, scattering shards of light into the thinning mist. The bobcat paused at the porch edge, its small body haloed in morning gold, and turned to meet her gaze. It held the look for a heartbeat, then blinked slowly, the same gesture of trust it had first offered in the shadows weeks ago. Ellie felt the echo of that blink deep in her chest. She understood now that trust once given could remake a life. It didn't erase loss or change the past, but it planted a seed in the quiet soil of the present, and from that seed, something stronger than grief could grow. Marble brushed against her leg, his purr vibrating through her boot. She bent to stroke his fur, eyes still on the bobcat, and whispered, "You've changed everything, little one." The kitten turned back to the slope, tail flicking, and leapt lightly into the snow, its paws left clean, perfect prints in the white, a small constellation leading toward the creek. Marble followed at a leisurely pace, his ginger coat bright against the pale world. Ellie stood on the porch, a silent witness to the simple miracle of life moving forward. In that moment, she realized that healing hadn't arrived like a wave. It had come like the mountain's own seasons, gradual, quiet, and unstoppable. And in that quiet transformation, she found herself willing to hope again. If you've ever found healing in an unexpected bond, subscribe to join others who believe love doesn't need to be loud to be real. Tell me in the comments, how has an animal changed your life? The sun rose higher, scattering the last of the frost into sparkling droplets. Ellie watched the two cats, one domestic, one wild, disappear toward the edge of the trees. Her cabin, once a hollow refuge, now hummed with the memory of paw prints and the promise of spring. Spring came to the Smoky Mountains in a whisper. It began with the drip of melted icicles and the first shy shoots of green pushing through last year's brown leaves. The creek below the cabin sang louder each day, swollen with snowmelt and rain, and the air carried the earthy perfume of damp soil and blooming dogwood. The world that had been wrapped in silence now pulsed with life. By then the bobcat was no longer a kitten in need. Its body had lengthened, muscles lean and sure under its sleek spotted coat. The ear tufts that once trembled in uncertainty now stood like confident flags. It moved through the cabin with the soft authority of a visitor who knew it belonged for a time, but not forever. Ellie had always known this day would come. The wildlife officer's advice echoed in her mind. Care can be a gift, but freedom is the greater one. She had promised herself that the wild would remain wild. The bobcat had survived winter. Its spirit had never been broken, only sheltered until it could stand on its own. That morning, the air smelled of rain and new beginnings. Ellie opened the cabin door, and Marble trotted to the porch as if sensing the significance of the moment. The bobcat followed, pausing at the threshold, nostrils flaring as it tested the breeze. The forest had called all along, softly at first, then with the irresistible pull of instinct. It stepped onto the porch, claws clicking softly against the wood. Its golden eyes scanned the slope, and for a moment it hesitated, glancing back at Ellie. She felt a lump rise in her throat, a swell of pride and sadness braided together. "Go on," she whispered, voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "You're ready." The bobcat moved with deliberate grace down the porch steps, Marble following halfway before sitting back, tail curling around his paws. The wildcat reached the edge of the clearing where sunlight spilled through new leaves, turning the world into a soft mosaic of green and gold. It paused, and in that pause, time held its breath. Then it looked back. The gesture was small, just a turn of the head, a blink in the morning light, but Ellie felt it like a heartbeat pressed into her palm. It was not a plea, not a goodbye, but an acknowledgement, a thank you in the language of presence. She didn't wave or call out. Some bonds were too sacred for noise. She simply stood with Marble at her side, hand resting on his warm fur, and watched the bobcat step into the trees. Its coat flashed between the branches once, twice, and then it was gone, claimed by the green shadows of its birthright. The porch felt quieter than it had in months, but not empty. The silence no longer pressed on Ellie like a weight. It wrapped her like a soft blanket, carrying the memory of every paw print and slow blink. She realized that love had always been less about holding on than about bearing witness. Sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go with grace. She turned to Marble, whose eyes still watched the trees with feline composure. "We did good," she murmured. He flicked his tail once, as if in agreement, then leapt to the porch swing, curling into a contented loaf. Ellie leaned on the railing, breathing in the smell of wet earth and young leaves. Her heart felt tender but full, like soil after a long winter, ready to grow something new. She thought of all the ways presence had saved her, how a silent cat, a wild kitten, and a mountain winter had taught her that life continues quietly, even when it feels like it has stopped. Weeks later, she would sometimes catch sight of a young bobcat moving along the far ridge at dusk, a brief flicker of spots and motion. Whether it was her bobcat, she could never be sure, but in her heart she knew the truth. Once you've been seen in your brokenness and allowed another to heal in your shadow, the connection never truly disappears. The mountains held her in their timeless rhythm, and she whispered into the warming air, "Thank you." Love, she realized, doesn't need to be loud to be real. It only needs to be witnessed and allowed to return to the world stronger than before.